video documentary on slavery, trying to put everything I possibly could into it. And the understanding that you need to come away with, I tell you about all races, religions, people all over the world, since the dawn of time, since man has evolved into man. Man has enslaved its own race, its people, that even no matter how much they look like the people in power, the people in power decide to enslave the people who are not in power. In China, the emperor enslaved the poor Chinese people and made them build pyramids out of dirt. All day long they would pound the dirt until they built up this pyramid of dirt. Now the communist government has covered these pyramids with trees to kind of cover up the fact that these are actually pyramids, but it's pyramids made out of dirt. And they would work so hard that they would just drop dead, and they'd kick them. They'd have on the side of the pyramid, there was a deep ditch that you just kick the bodies into. I'm sure there was sorrow, the families of these people that died, but these families, people of China, knew what class they were in, and their lives were expendable. It's the same race enslaving their own race, but it's a class system. You're beneath. And it happened in the tribes in Europe as well. They enslaved each other. The white people were enslaving all the white people. And the Slavs, who are white, were the most enslaved people. But throughout history, no one has been enslaved longer or more than the Slavs. Yet we forget that, and they are white. And I'm sure that their families cried when they were taken away. But slavery existed in the world until it was eradicated in the Western world. It ended. It was here in America for about 300 years. Then it ended. But it was the norm. Everybody enslaved everybody else. The rich enslaved the poor. The poor were killed. If they did any crime at all, they were hung. That way they eradicate the lower class populations. Then they said, why don't we just sell these people into slavery? And we're talking about white people enslaving white people. And in England, there were these kind of like a dungeon. You would move this iron lid over and cut into the concrete or into the stone floor. You would see down into the darkness. You'd see these metal spikes sticking up. And when somebody did something wrong, they didn't like them. Of course, they were poor, they're in lower classes. It was called like the hole of hell is what it was called. And they would throw them on these spikes, and they would die slowly on these spikes. They put the cover on it so the wealthy people didn't hear the screams. You can't say this is racism, but it's classism. I think all slavery is basically classism, because we had white slave owners in America, and we had 10% of them were African. But they were of a different class. They were of the higher classes. So it really had nothing to do with racism. And when you say, Africans, since the inception of the continent, when man evolved into man, Africa, that's where all of us, basically, our roots go back to Africa. All our roots. Right from the beginning, Africans have been enslaving other Africans. To say that is not racism, because all these other cultures, the whites, the Chinese, India, there was slavery. If you gave birth to a girl, she was killed. In China, they have sex selection. If it's a girl, they kill it. They have no sorrow for that child that dies because a girl is a burden. No sorrow at all. And that's a baby. So all these races, all these people, if you want to classify humans who can mate with each other, if we mate with each other, we're actually the same species. There's no such thing as race. There's only one race. It's the human race. And we develop differently because we lived in different parts of the world, grew up eating different foods, walked over different terrain, and absorbed different cultures and created our own myths and music and style of dress. And tribes, people, countries constantly were conquering other tribes and countries, absorbing them in, taking them in as slaves, taking the women as sex slaves. This happened all over the world. Every single continent. There's nobody that's more or less guilty of this. Everybody did it. Everybody on earth has got an ancestor that's been enslaved. They may have been a slave owner, a slave trader, or has been enslaved. And it's too bad that we can't look at it. It's too bad that we have these victim cultures, because all of us are connected to peoples who have been victims. All of us. That we have to look at certain groups as victim groups, that you will always be a victim. You will always be discriminated because of the color of your skin. You'll be discriminated, and you're born hearing that. And then you grow up thinking you're a victim. If we could just look at each other and say, your people have suffered too. My people have suffered. You personally could have suffered more than a group that's considered a victim group. You could personally have suffered more, like Fraulein Frizzell. She's pretty much suffered more than anybody I have ever heard of. And if you've heard that story, Fraulein Frizzell, it's a pretty horrible one. But she was German and she was white, Fraulein Frizzell. So people individually can suffer more than people even in a group that's considered oppressed. So we should really look at each other and say, you know what? We're not victims. We don't have to be victims, even though we have suffered, our ancestors have suffered. We can choose to be victors, like Booker T. Washington and George Washington Carver. Booker T. Washington started the first school for freed slaves, descendants of Africans. He started Tuskegee University, and he hired George Washington Carver. He was brilliant. He was a genius. They were both geniuses, and they were both former slaves. How did they get all this education that they were able to start a college? Can you imagine the intelligence that they had? And Booker T. Washington tried to pump out the idea, like, look, no, don't say that you're a slave. Don't say you're a victim. Forget the past. Look towards the future. You can overcome this. You are not defeated. Just because you were in a situation where you were a slave and you were oppressed, you are free now. Think free, be free, and become something. Use your mind and your soul and your body and your heart and your imagination. Become something. Become victorious. He didn't ascribe to victim mentality. Now, in Africa, there's an idea Abraham Lincoln wanted, and a lot of people in this country wanted to return the slaves back to Africa, which was not a good idea. From the beginning, Africans have enslaved other Africans. People in power do that. They enslave people of class, it's nothing to do with race, or that the people of Africa are bad. Because I'm for the people who were the made slaves. The people who oppressed other people, I don't like them. I don't care what color skin they are. If they happen to be black, I am going to root for the people who are oppressed, who are made slaves, and I will do my best to try to free them. That's what we should be doing now. Because right now there's 6 million slaves in Africa. Black slaves owned by other black Africans. That's their way of life. It's not against the law in Africa. You would think slavery. People think that slavery only happened in America, which we got 500,000 slaves. South America got 9,500,000 slaves. Arabia killed as much as 200 million. That's just the ones that they killed, not the ones that they took and lived and didn't kill. But it's mostly sex slavery and making men into eunuchs, and 1 out of every 30 men died. So the idea that reparations should be paid by the Western world kind of doesn't make sense, because since the world functioned, that's how the world functioned, slavery, all over the world, it was dying out in America. Not quite in South America. In America, because they invented the cotton gin and industrialization came in, and having slaves was way too costly. A slave cost 50 silver coins, and maintaining slaves was way too costly. Bringing in the industrialization of agriculture made it cheaper, and so people could work in factories, and slavery was actually dying out. During the Civil War, slavery was dying out. But they had this idea, Abraham Lincoln had this idea with a bunch of other people to send them back to Africa. Imagine living here for 300 years or however long your family was in here, 100 years, 50 years, 25 years, and then being sent back to Africa. And the reason why you came here was because tribes would fight against other tribes. The king of one tribe, who won, sold the entire tribe out as slaves. They brought them to the coast, because in Africa, there's a lot of diseases. There's a lot of wild animals and boas. And it's a very, unless you know where you're going, there's no way to say, oh yes, we can get a bunch of slaves over here. We can bypass the boas and the malaria and then the lions and the cheetahs, and we can just take these people. That isn't how it worked. The winners of the war brought the losers, the entire tribe, mothers, fathers, children, to the coast. And in Africa, the tribal system was different than, we have an idea of family in the West that's mother, father, children. In Africa, they had a different way of doing things. Like the whole tribe would kind of take care. All the women would take care of the children. The men would go out and get the food and do the fighting. Women would take care of the children. It was kind of like everybody was kind of taking care of everybody. It was a little different way. So who was your mother? Who's your father? Everybody's your aunt, your uncle, kind of everybody's probably related to everyone. So if you sent these people back, these people were the losers of the war. These people were sold by the winners of the war. The people who stayed in Africa were the winners of the war. They traded the losers for guns, for anything they want. That's why it was called a slave trade. They were trading them for goods around the world that they wanted that Africa was not producing. And you would be the winner of the war, rest assured, if you had a gun. So you give me some guns, I'll give you the losers. That's what happened. Who was bad? I don't think it was. I don't like the people who sold the losers too. But I suppose they could have taken them in and they could have killed them. But they do take them and keep them as slaves. I suggest you check out the website walkfree.org. There are 10 times as many slaves in the world today, people that are actually enslaved, than there were at the height of the African slave trade. People don't realize this. And 6 million in Africa alone. And with the population growing, the population is growing exponentially in Africa, that there will be more slaves, and more every year. There'll be more. And if you're born of a slave, you are a slave. The slave owners, they own you, just like in America. The master, if they owned the mother and the father, they own the child. The child was born a slave. That's the way it is in Africa as well. That's the way it is with all these slaves all over the world. If you're born of a slave, you are owned by the same master that your parents are owned by. And that's the way it is. So if these people returned to Africa, what would happen to them? They would look at them. They wouldn't greet them back because their family isn't even there anyway. The entire tribe, the losing tribe, the entire tribe was sold to the world by the winning tribe. So there were no, your ancestors, your people, your family, everybody, the whole thing was taken and then sold to the world. But that's the way the world worked. The world was worked by slavery. That's how it was run. That's why did America say, oh, that's wrong. America should have known no slavery. But everywhere in the world there was slavery. And they were enslaving white people before the African slave trade started. And the Arabs started the African slave trade 1,400 years ago. That's why there's so many that died. And that's why there's no Africans. You will not see in Arabia, black people in Arabia. Dark-skinned people, not black, because most of them were killed off because they would kill the child of the sex slave, the African woman, the child of the African woman, who by the union of the Arab and the African woman, they killed the child immediately. And the men, they were envious and jealous of the prowess of the African male. So they castrated him to make him a eunuch, and only 1 in 30 survived. That's why so many were killed. Imagine how many that lived and were kept as slaves, and the amount that were killed outright with babies and the men dying after being castrated. That's an enormous amount. So slavery had been going on, and so England, when they colonized America, English colonies came over. Jamestown was the first place. That was an English colony. It wasn't the Pilgrims who wanted to be separate. Jamestown brought over the first slaves because England had African slaves. In fact, the first free black person was born in 1606 in Florida. He actually was born free, not born under slave conditions. So African, or descendants of Africans, have been here longer than practically everyone. Practically everyone, except for the few people who've got some ancestry from pilgrims and way back when. People with African ancestry who came to this country were here for 400 years. They were here right from the beginning. It's amazing. That's why they really are Americans. I get tongue-tied when I say African American because they're not African. They're Americans first, and they're Americans before most of all of us who came later are. We are less. They actually are the true Americans, by the way. So this has nothing to do with race, because all races did it. But it was abolished in the Western world because we realized all men are created equal and have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We saw in the documents, the documents of the founding fathers didn't make sense because we could see they were human. And we listened to when we went to church services, we heard, when I was hungry, you fed me. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was in prison, you visited me. When I was sick, you comforted me. Lord, when did we do these things for you? He who does these things to the least of mine, he does it to me. So upon hearing these things, between the documents of the founding fathers, which the socialists, the Democrats want to abolish these documents, that we have the right that's endowed by our Creator to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And these rights cannot be taken away because they were given to us by a Creator. Communism, which they want to bring us towards, takes away God altogether. So your rights are given to you by the state. If the state says you have no rights or you're less of a person, majority rule. That's majority rule. That's why we can't get rid of the electoral system. A republic speaks for the minority. So if the majority wants to enslave the majority will vote for it. That's why you don't want popular vote. That's why you don't. That will override the minority's voice. You don't want to do that because you will end up enslaving somebody. Somebody will get oppressed. Somebody will get... In communism, the state takes all your possessions and all your money. And Bernie Sanders, who's a millionaire that owns 3 houses, he's a very good socialist. He wants to take all your money away, make you poor, redistribute it, but just like any good communist, he went on his honeymoon to Soviet Russia. As any good communist dictator does. You keep most of the money for yourself. That's what you do. And I heard him yelling today, I'm fighting for the people, so the people can have this free stuff. I'm fighting for the people. No, you're not fighting for the people. You want to take all the money away from the people and you want to still live the high life. You're not fighting to make everyone equally poor while you're on top. If we make you president, if we're stupid enough to do that, I could go through that whole speech. Oh my God, it's unbelievably wrong. Completely. His whole life he's been fighting. No, he got his first job working for the government, getting paid by the taxpayers to sit there and make a decision now and then. At the age of 40, he didn't have a job until the age of 40. Would mean he's been working his whole life. He's been reading Marx and Trotsky his whole life, for God, and Saul Alinsky his whole life, for God's sakes, and bowing to the embalmed body of Lenin, for God's sakes. Anyway, communism. There's another form of slavery. It's killed. They say that Stalin killed at least 30 million people, probably more. We now have realized that Mao killed 45 million in 4 years, up to 78 million by the end of his reign. And Pol Pot killed less of the Khmer Rouge, 1,500,000. That's what communism does. It enslaves the people and it kills the people. And we're headed straight for it. So when you think of slavery, and people in China were so oppressed that they committed suicide because Mao would send out gangs to oppress them, especially if you're middle class. He hated the middle class. He just wanted the dirt poor that he could oppress, and then he's at the top, right? He even killed the elites too, because they weren't going for this communism thing. He had them all killed too. So slavery, that's also a form of slavery. And it's happened in, you consider Russia, well, those are the Slavs. They're enslaved again. They got enslaved by communism, didn't they? Again, the most enslaved people on the face of the earth are the Slavs, who are white. And then the Chinese, and of course you got your Venezuelans that are all, that's a whole mess. So slavery, can you pin it on the whites? Can you pin it on the blacks? Can you pin it on the Asians? Can you pin it on the South Asians? Who can you pin it on? Man's inclination to dominate man. Man's inclination for power. And man devising a system of classes. Or communism, yes, there's two classes. There's the dictator on the top, and everybody's equally poor and enslaved on the bottom and starving to death, and there's no medical care because there's no money for medical innovation. You can kill a lot of people off that way by saying, yes, free healthcare for everyone, but there are no doctors because it takes a lot of intelligence and a lot of time to be a doctor. And there aren't enough doctors to take care of everyone. So basically a lot of people die off. So who has the sin of slavery? All mankind. All of us do. All of us, since the dawn of time, have been either enslaved, mass murdered. Genghis Khan killed 100 million people. He devised methods of killing that are more effective than even with our guns today. Genghis Khan did. It's amazing how many people that he killed with these ancient military weapons. Who has the greatest? Well, if we did come out of Africa, and all of us came out of Africa, all of us evolved into modern man out of Africa, no matter what we look like now. It is the oldest place. It's the cradle from whence we began. And so it would have the longest history of slavery. And slavery is legal in Africa. So if we sent all the black people back, all the freed slaves back to Africa, what would happen? Everyone in Africa, the winners of the war, would say, hey, you're either the losers, I know you, or you're a descendant of the losers of the war. We're going to enslave. They would have been enslaved all over again. That's what would have happened because they're marked. They're in a different class. They were sold as slaves, so they had no other future if they went back to Africa than to be enslaved by the people in power, because the people in power knew that everybody left on the slave trade were the losers of the war, were not considered human. Africans considered people of the same race as not human because they were the losers. That's how tribes saw each other, even though Native Americans and the Native people here were genetically very close. One tribe saw the other tribe as not quite human. That's why. They took them and they did all those mass sacrifices, cutting their hearts out, 5,000 to 6,000 a day, flaying people alive, and then because they had a god, the Aztec god would wear human skin, so they would imitate that god by taking the skin off in one piece and wearing it, and the hands would hang below their hands. So all these native people, everybody's guilty of something. But like I said in my last video, that even if you were a tribe that wanted to be peaceful, you were people that wanted to be peaceful. There was always a tribe, there's always a country that was like, hey, they live peacefully. They don't make war. There's no weapons. See, when a country doesn't have any weapons, they can't defend themselves. Let's go take them. We'll either commit genocide or kill all the men, and we'll take all the women, all the pretty young women we'll take. It's even in the Bible. That's when the Jews, they say, left Egypt, they warred on all these other people and committed genocide, wiped whole people out. And they took the women who were virgins as sex slaves. It's right there in the Bible. But archaeology has looked at all these places and kind of said, no war happened here. There's no evidence of any of this. It was kind of like probably guys sitting around making up, yeah, we did this and we did that and we warred on all these and we were the victors. I can imagine that's archaeology. If you put the two together, archaeology kind of has to win on that one. But that's what man did since the dawn of time. All colors, all religions that don't exist anymore, cultures, ethnicities that don't exist anymore. That's what man's inhumanity to man. And that's the story of mankind, man meaning human. That's the story of our race as a people. We are all a people. Doesn't matter what we look like or how much melanin content we have in our skin. That is our story. Good night, everyone. And be peaceful, be kind, and look at each other knowing that the history of their people was rough, just like the history of my people. We can look at each other and not see victim looking into the eyes of an oppressor, but maybe don't look at each other as victims or oppressors, or one winning over the other. Both of you have we all have it in us to survive, to grow, to be educated, to be better people, to be victorious. So we need to stop this whole victim mentality, telling groups of people that they're victims and there will always be victims. No, it is not true. Read Booker T. Washington and George Washington Carver. Booker T. Washington, absolutely, both of them were geniuses, but the way Booker T. Washington thought and what he tried to convey to the freed slaves was something that everyone needs to learn, because people can be oppressed no matter what color their skin is. You don't know what their family life is. You don't know what the history of their life is. They can be oppressed and be abused. We don't know. But everyone could benefit by learning about Booker T. Washington and the way he thought. The man was a former slave, and look at what he did. He started the first university for freed slaves and Africans, so they'd have a future. They'd have a future, and they'd be educated, and they'd be victorious, and they'd know who they were. They were not losers of any war. They were victorious. Thank you, everyone, and good night.